I used to think a house learns the rhythm of its people the way a fiddle learns a player's touch, storing every habit and heartbeat in the wood, answering each morning with the same familiar creaks. So when the kettle rattles on the burner and the back door chain knocks twice against the frame, the place seems to say, "There you are, I know you. Come sit where the light falls just right." My mornings start that way still, though the other chair at the kitchen table has been empty for 5 years, and the second mug on the rack is more a memorial than a utensil. I move slower than I used to, not for show and not from laziness, but because slowness feels like reverence, and I'm reverent about small things. The hiss before the coffee boils, the smell of toast browning to the edge of burnt, the weathered feel of the newspaper, even though most of the news reaches me on the radio long before the paperboy's bicycle squeaks up the walk. I rinse the mug first with hot water, the way Marianne always insisted, so it won't shock the coffee, and I tap the spoon twice against the rim, and I carry everything to the table, where the sun lifts over the maple and lays a pale gold on the oilcloth, and for a moment each day I believe this is enough, that this quiet is an earned peace rather than the aftertaste of an argument I never finished with time. You would think a man my age might stop taking stock, but inventory is a habit I brought home from a lifetime of keeping other people's books and making sure someone's lobster shack or tire shop didn't drown in a tide of receipts and guesswork. I still write numbers on a pad by the telephone, columns for utilities and groceries and the little things that grow teeth if you pretend they're small, and I still track the dates on the pill bottles with a pen line over each morning. I swallow the bitter one for the pressure and the chalky one for the buzz in my legs. The doctor says I'm doing fine for 74, that the heart murmurs like an old engine but turns over every day, that walking is better than sitting and vegetables do more good than complaining. He smiles when he says it, which makes the advice harder to resent. I walk the block. I wave to the mailman whose beard has gone from black to salt in the years I've watched him. I pause at the corner where Mr. Pena takes the covers off his tomato plants if the night stayed warm, and sometimes I stand too long by the fence of the house with the dog that ricochets off the porch boards with excitement to see me, because it's a good thing to be welcomed, even when the welcome is all tongue and noise. On Sundays I still iron a shirt and go to church. Not because I am devout the way I was when the children were small and the pew felt like a lifeboat in a busy sea, but because I like the sound of the hymnals and the way the ladies from the choir pat it. My hand and ask after my knees, and because coffee in the parish hall tastes like a time before everything was in a hurry to be over. When my daughter calls, which happens less like a ritual and more like weather, sudden and a little cold, I put on the voice I kept for clients who came in ashamed of their shoe boxes of unpaid bills, a careful calm with room for their excuses, though I wish that habit had no place in a conversation with my own child. I know what I sound like to her, a man who circles his point like a dog circling a rug before he lies down, and I don't blame her for the sigh I can hear even when she hides it. Our history is full of moments where I should have spoken quicker, or softer, and I did neither, not because I wanted the last word, but because words felt like money to be spent carefully, and who wants to make a spectacle of himself with grammar and grief? Evelyn grew up decisive. She came into the world as if pulled forward by a task only she could see, and by 12 she knew which college would suit her, and by 20 she had the job that would pay for the city view and the pantsuits and the loud laughter her mother and I loved to hear when she thought we were out of earshot. The truth is, I admire her certainty, even when it cuts me, the way a sharp tool is more useful and more dangerous than a dull one, and I know there were nights she thought I was a dull man, that I could have dreamed bigger and fought harder and moved us faster toward whatever Christmas card picture she measured us against. If you look at the family album, which no one does anymore because pictures now live inside telephones like trapped birds, you'll see a little girl with gap teeth and bandaged knees perched on a cooler at the lake. You'll see the day she won the spelling bee and the day she learned to pump herself on the swing, you'll see the house behind us that has not changed much except the paint and the new shingles I saved for. And in those pictures, you'll see a triangle of faces where the corners cannot imagine not belonging to each other. I keep those albums in the lower drawer of the sideboard, so I have to bend to reach them, and bending becomes a reminder that memory ought to cost a small effort, or else it turns cheap. After Marianne passed, a stroke that crossed our life like a chalk line drawn by a hand that did not ask permission. Evelyn became brisk with grief. She moved through the house like someone setting a table for guests who unexpectedly cancelled, clearing, stacking, tossing, folding. And when she left that first afternoon, she took Marianne's blue scarf as if it had been waiting for her, and I didn't mind, not then, because the scent of her mother in that scarf might have been the only soft thing in her apartment for a while. The months after were a mixture of casseroles from neighbors and quiet evenings with the radio murmuring the ball game because I could not stand the sound of my own breathing, and though Evelyn visited twice and phoned sometimes, there was a new distance measured not in miles, but in topics we avoided, and in how quickly we ran out of them. People like to say a widower should not make big decisions for a year, which sounds sensible in a pamphlet and impossible in a kitchen where a burner is still set to Marianne's preferred simmer, and every drawer contains a surprise that feels like a reprimand. I did not sell the house, though Evelyn hinted. I did not move closer to her, though she said the hospitals in her city were better and I might need them. Instead, I stayed, mowing the lawn in a slow rectangle that kept me inside the borders, understood, fixing the loose stair tread I had ignored for years, hauling the box of winter coats to the attic and bringing it back down too early because habit is stronger than climate. The money we had saved and the pension I earned turned out sufficient for a life that asks more for groceries and medicine than for airplane tickets and novelty, and I felt a small pride each month when the numbers balanced, not because I had outwitted anyone, but because solvency is a kind of dignity. Sometimes Evelyn would ask about the accounts in a tone I chose not to hear as prying. Sometimes she'd tilt the conversation so that what sounded like concern for my health bent toward the shape of logistics. Which pharmacy, which attorney, which key hides where, and I'd answer with details, because details have always been my way to offer love, though I knew the map I was giving her pointed to rooms she might one day enter without knocking. I am not blind to my shortcomings, not at this age when the body announces each one with a new reluctance, and if you asked my daughter for a list, she could supply a bristling page with examples, the way a teacher marks a paper, red ink and size. 2. Stubborn when it would have been kinder to yield, too proud to ask for help even when the ladder wobbled, too slow to praise when the world already stung her with its judgments, too quick to save when spending might have created memories she would value now more than the tidy ledger I bequeathed. Maybe I held her too closely to the rules that steadied me. Pay on time, speak plain, apologize only when you mean it, keep Sunday for rest and pie, and maybe in her world those rules looked like fences when she needed wings. Yet the shape of a father's work is often noticed only in its absence. The light that turns on because the bill was paid, the oil that never ran dry because someone remembered, the yard that did not swallow the toddler because someone pushed a mower. Even in the heat, and I have never asked for applause for those ordinary victories, though I would not mind if the tail-wagging dog at the corner sometimes belonged to a person who knew my middle name. There is an hour in the afternoon when the shadow of the maple crawls across the living room rug, and the house goes quiet as a church between services, and in that hour I sit with the radio low and let the day replay itself while the dust in the light looks like snow we once prayed for as children. In that hour, I often think of the last Christmas we were truly 3, the one where Evelyn arrived with 2 dessert boxes and a bottle of sparkling something and a new boyfriend we pretended not to evaluate, and the turkey came out dry because I talked too long on the phone with the neighbor whose furnace had quit, and Marianne laughed with her hand on my shoulder in a way that said, forgiveness was a habit here, and Evelyn sang along with the carols off-key on purpose to make us smile. It is a memory so ordinary you could miss it if you were scanning for miracles, and perhaps that is why I never noticed how far away from that room we had drifted, until I looked up one day and realized my daughter's voice on the phone was a visitor's voice. She does not mean to sound like that, I tell myself. She is busy, she is harried, she is stretched thin by work and the 1,000 little battery-eating devices that blink at us from every horizontal surface, and even kindness sounds transactional when you're tired, and life makes everything a receipt. I do not keep score, or at least I try not to, but I am not immune to the arithmetic of affection, to the way a man begins to notice what is asked of him and what is offered, and it is true that the last time Evelyn visited, she asked if my spare key was still under the painted turtle by the stoop and whether I had considered automatic bill pay so nothing falls through the cracks. And it is true that she lingered over the folder in the desk drawer, where I keep the will and the house deed and the list of passwords written in a code so simple any family member would break it and any stranger would stumble. And it is also true that when she hugged me at the door, I could smell a new perfume that cost more than the groceries in my bag. Yet I am not a cynic. I do not believe my daughter is a villain summoned by the devil to punish me for thrift or stubbornness. I believe she is someone who learned to count differently than I did, who measures love by acts I sometimes fail to recognize, and who has come to think the world will devour you if you do not devour first. And I suspect she believes she is protecting me when she tells me to eat less salt and hire someone for the gutters and stop carrying cash because no one uses it anymore, Dad. The house holds my days like a steady hand, and in the quiet, I can imagine many futures that do not require anyone else to approve them. I could take the bus to the shore the way Marianne and I used to do on her birthday. I could repaint the bedroom a softer yellow and forgive myself the drip marks along the trim. I could join the men who meet at the diner on Wednesdays to trade. Gossip about politics and backs and war stories that all end with laughter as a mercy. I could even sell the place and find a smaller apartment with an elevator and neighbors who knock if the shade does not rise by noon. I have not done any of that, not yet, because decisions feel heavier now, not because I fear the effort, but because each choice seems to close a door that will not open again, and I am greedy for doorways. Somewhere in the middle of each day I tell myself, I'm fine as long as I can tell what o'clock it is by the angle of light in the hallway, and somewhere near dusk, when the news reminds me the world runs on cruelty and luck in equal portions, I tell myself there is time still to be brave in the small ways, to call back a friend I have neglected, to try the new market one bus stop farther than I usually go, to say yes to a dinner invitation even if the restaurant is the loud sort where conversation competes with performance. If I am honest, I think about money more than I admit. Not because I love it, but because it is the language everyone seems to understand, even when they claim to despise it. The stack in the savings account looks like security until someone says aloud what it could buy, and then it begins to look like temptation. And I have noticed that when Evelyn visits, talk soon wanders to interest rates and long-term care and whether the roof will last another winter. Perhaps she has inherited my worry and it wears a sharper suit on her shoulders. Perhaps she cannot remember a time when I was the unshakable one and imagines danger in every silence. Perhaps she is simply practical in a way that requires other people to supply the softness. I try not to resent that, and most days I succeed, but there are hours when I imagine telling her that my life is not a ledger to be optimized, and that I am not a line item to be shifted into a cheaper column, that the peanut butter I choose by brand, loyalty, and the coffee I buy on sale with a coupon are not careless luxuries, but the small proofs that I am still captain of my own modest ship. Evenings, when the porch light snaps on and the street settles into the sigh a neighborhood makes after supper, I sit with the window a little open and listen to the cricket chorus and the train that passes far enough away to be romantic and Enough to be real, and I think about calling Evelyn just to hear her tell me something ordinary about her day. Sometimes I do call, and sometimes she answers, and sometimes she does not, and in either case I remind myself not to read too much into these minor results, since life is a lot of small misses and catches that average toward love if you are patient. When I do speak to her, I lean toward my better self, the one that asks about her projects and remembers the names of colleagues I've never met. The one that laughs at the right places and does not correct her estimates of what groceries cost now. The one that knows she lives inside a blistering wind called expectation and that it has little to do with me. Then I hang up and wash my dishes and set the cup upside down on the towel and think of how very long a day can be when the future asks nothing specific of you. So this is my life, not a sorrow-soaked tragedy and not a victory parade. Just the sum of habits and a few stubborn hopes that rise every morning with the smell of coffee and the hum of the old refrigerator. And if it sounds uneventful, that may be. Because I have learned to prize uneventful as the ground where gratitude grows. I do not know what next week holds or whether the maple will outlast me. I do not know if my daughter will ever understand the way I carry love like a pocket knife, useful and unshowy and always a little dangerous. I do not know what I will say. Next time she visits and looks around my kitchen as if taking stock of an estate not yet open for business. But I know this house still recognizes me. I know the dog at the corner will bounce against the fence tomorrow as if I am a parade of one. I know that somewhere inside my daughter is the child who asked me to cut her pancakes into stars and who thought I could fix anything with a screwdriver and a joke. And I know that for now I am the keeper of a quiet that is my own, living a life that could be mistaken for small, until one day some sentence, soft as breath and sharp as a bill, will turn the light in the room and show me which doorway I have been walking toward all along. The call came mid-afternoon when the sun had flattened itself across the kitchen linoleum, and the kettle had only just started its breathy complaint. And in that harmless hour, my daughter's voice sounded almost like a season I had been missing, bright and busy and warmed by the promise of plans, so that when she said we should all have dinner together at her place, nothing fancy, just the three of us and maybe a neighbor who dropped by with a pie, I said yes before common sense could finish. Clearing its throat, because it is difficult for an old man to resist an invitation that seems to restore him to the bright center of a family that has long since learned to orbit without him. I ironed a shirt I saved for Sundays and clipped a dull bloom of aftershave to my jaw, and because I did not want to be a burden or to give any of them reason to sigh about rides and schedules, I took the bus up Maple, holding the rail at every turn, as if the city had been greased to hurry other people home. Along the way I rehearsed the light questions that leave no dents. How is work? Is the apartment still quiet? Did the building ever fix the elevator that stuttered between floors? And I told myself I would not bring up money or wills or any topic that makes a daughter's shoulders lift to her ears, that I would be agreeable to the menu and to the music and even to the small corrections grown children offer their elders like safety rails. On stairways they themselves installed, her building smelled like citrus cleaner and new paint, and the hallway lights carved a glossy line down the center of the carpet. And when she opened the door, she looked beautiful in that busy way. Success gives people not a strand of hair out of order, not a gesture without reason, and behind her the apartment held itself like a magazine page. White counters without crumbs, a vase of eucalyptus pretending to be air, the soft hum of an appliance that chilled wine to the perfect temperature, and, though my name sat on her lips, though she kissed my cheek and took my coat and said she was so glad I came, I felt already the careful choreography of a night she had planned down to the minute, and I knew the best gift I could give was to fit neatly into those minutes without spilling any hopefulness on the rug. She had set the table the way Marianne always did for company, with the good cloth and the napkins tucked through rings that had once belonged to my mother-in-law, and I allowed myself the small superstition that this detail meant more than Decoration because it is a comfort to pretend that continuity is a choice rather than an accident. The candles were unlit, which meant we were being practical, and a bottle stood breathing near the sink, which meant we were being festive, and the smell coming from the oven did not belong to any memory I had. Some complicated roast whose herbs announced themselves like people reading introductions at a conference they thought too important for handshakes. Her husband, who has never learned how to be at ease with me except at a distance, poured me water in a glass heavier than my expectations and asked about my knees with the politeness of a man reading questions from a card. He kept his eyes on the counter where a tablet glowed with a spreadsheet, and I felt the familiar prickle I get when numbers enter a room to argue about the cost of things that cannot be priced. We sat, the three of us, in a triangle that made conversation feel like a geometry problem, and talk moved the way it always does now. That is to say, with the speed of an airport moving walkway and the same suspicion that if you step off to look, around you will never find your place again. She told me a story about a client who wanted the impossible on a deadline that disrespected clocks, and I offered the quiet pride of a father who recognizes a daughter's competence even when it comes. Wrapped in exhaustion, and for a while we almost passed as the family we used to be, the smell of the roast convincing us all that effort and hunger still recognized each other. Food arrived the way a show arrives, with the hush of plates placed just so, and the flourish of a sauce drawn like a map over the meat, and there were little bowls with jewel-bright things in them, pomegranate seeds like spilled rubies, and a salad that had been shaved into ribbons too fine to belong to a garden, and I told myself I would not embarrass anyone by asking for salt or by telling a story I'd told before, and I meant it, because dignity is as much a gift to others as it is a guard around your own heart. We began, polite and slow, her husband speaking with a mouth already planning the rest of his sentence, my daughter moving between bites and directives as if she were running a small studio audience, and I did what old men do when they are grateful, and afraid of showing it, which is to eat carefully and laugh quietly and make sure the napkin does its quiet work. When I reached for a second roll, warm, still, butter set out at the kind temperature that forgives impatience, she leaned toward me in a movement that would have looked like tenderness to anyone glancing through the window. And in that stage whisper people use when they want to pass off a cut as a confidence, she breathed, "Don't eat too much. You're expensive," and smiled in the direction of her husband as if to prove she had said nothing at all. The sentence wasn't loud and it wasn't long, but it opened the room like a trap door under a magician's assistant, and for a heartbeat I believed I must have misheard, that the aid I wear in my left ear had taken liberties with language, that what she meant was generous and grown somewhere kinder than the narrow garden of offense where my mind had lately learned to plant every phrase. Yet the plate dimmed in front of me, and the fork felt like a borrowed tool, and I found myself staring at the clean line her knife made through meat, thinking how easily a single word can undo years of meals in which no tally was kept beyond thanks. Because I'm a man who will always try to make an alibi for the people I love, I told myself she was worried about my cholesterol and about the bill and about the way a fall costs more when you are old, that what she meant was everything that surrounds care and none of the insult that sits in the middle of it like a toothpick you only notice after your mouth bleeds. I told myself she was thinking in the language of her job, where every generous gesture is budgeted and every risk has a line where it is itemized, and that she had forgotten on this night, to which I had come in a shirt that still held Marianne's ironing heat, that a father's second roll has always been free. I did not speak, because some silences are the last intact plate you have left in the cupboard, and to break them would be to admit you are already living on shards, and also because the dog, that glossy black creature belonging to the neighbor who had indeed dropped by with pie and apologies about the leash, had stationed himself under the table with a connoisseur's patience, and I did not trust my hand not to perform the gesture my heart had already rehearsed. The room kept moving as rooms do after a small earthquake. A picture straightened itself with a soft click. Wine met glass. A laugh rose and fell like a gull at the beach. And only I knew that the floor under us was not the same floor. My daughter filled my water with a flourish that asked for praise, and I gave it, not because I was fooled, but because I have spent a lifetime believing that one kind sentence can slow a hard one's echo, and because I did not want her to see that in the space. Where appetite lives, something had gone cold. Dessert made its entrance with the kind of cheer people use when they want to unring a bell, and the pie did smell like mercy. Cinnamon and butter pretending that memory can be reheated and served a la mode. And for a few minutes we ate and pretended, but pretense has a short stride. And soon we were in the kitchen where counters turned conversation toward planning, and planning turns everyone into managers of each other's futures. Her husband, relieved to be on home turf, slid the tablet closer and said he had been thinking practically about my situation and that there were some excellent communities now. Not the old sort with institutional lighting and the slow smell of boiled vegetables, but places where people play cards and swim, and have their medication managed by professionals who do not fall asleep in front of televisions. And he had even, look at this, Dad, built a model that showed how very reasonable it could be if the house were liquidated at market and if my accounts were consolidated with an eye toward yield rather than sentiment. And as he talked, he touched the screen in a way that told me my name had been arranged into columns again, that someone had done the arithmetic of my days and concluded that a smaller portion would be both safer and cheaper. My daughter stood behind him with her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as if to steady the spreadsheet, and she said all the sentences kind people say when they have decided that kindness will be easier once you are somewhere you can be contained. That she worried about me falling on the back steps, that she worried about the neighborhood when the time change makes evenings jump, that she worried, in short, about costs, though she did not use that word again, not with her lips, because she had already spent it under her breath and it had bought her what she wanted, which was permission to believe that love looks like a plan. I watched the numbers behave themselves, and I heard my own voice perform its old trick of sounding reasonable while refusing to agree, and I felt something ancient and personal gather itself in the narrow hallway between my ribs. Not anger exactly, because anger is loud and showy and loves an audience, but a steadiness I've only felt twice before. Once when I decided to marry Marianne even though I had $21 and a toolbox, and once when I told a banker to take his predatory loan and feed it to the shredder, and I understood that the sentence at the table was not a joke or a slip or even a cruelty, but a diagnostic, a swift medical readout of how my daughter had begun to think of me and how I had allowed myself to be presented in her mind, not as a man who knows the taste of labor and the price of loyalty, not as a father who kept the roof uncomplaining even when the roof complained back, not even as a widower whose stubborn rituals are the last scaffolding around a life that has been weathered, but as a ledger entry that grows each time it is fed. I did not argue, because I have learned that arguing with a spreadsheet is like trying to sing down the wind, and I did not make a scene, because a scene would have turned me into exactly the caricature they had prepared, the cantankerous old man who resists sensible steps and refuses to respect the economy of everybody else's time. I thanked them for thinking of me, and I put my hand on my daughter's cheek the way I had when she was 6 and would not eat her oatmeal, and I told her the roast was excellent, and that I was proud of her work, and that I would get myself home. And I picked up my coat and felt in the pocket for the bus pass, as if reaching for an anchor. The night outside was cool and well-behaved, the kind of suburban evening that seems to have been vacuumed of unpredictability, porch lights waking one by one like careful stars, and while I walked toward the stop, the sentence kept pace with me. Not louder, because it did not need volume to own me, but steady, as if my shadow had found language. It perched on the awning of the shelter and folded its wings while the bus wheezed, and it rode beside me past the pharmacy and the bakery and the darkened park where swings remember laughter and keep it to themselves. And when I came into my kitchen and found the cup I had washed before leaving, the sentence climbed into the space where sugar lives and waited, and I understood I would not sleep as I had the night before, that the house had learned a new rhythm it did not want, and that nothing I did would make the floorboards forget. People imagine a catalyst as a strike of lightning or the smash of a plate. But sometimes it is only a whisper that writes itself in permanent ink on the inside of your patience. And sometimes it is the moment you reach for a second roll and discover that the hand you always extended in blessing has been reclassified as a hazard. And though I did not know exactly what would come next, though I could not have predicted the shape my answer would take or the quiet stage on which it would arrive, I knew with a clarity that did not need candles that I was finished auditioning for the role of affordable father, and that the arithmetic of my days would henceforth be done by me, in my own handwriting, with a pen whose ink would not run at the first sign of tears. The days after that dinner gathered around me like damp sheets, clinging and cold, and each hour seemed to carry the echo of her whisper, not fading but growing sharper, as if memory itself had teeth, and I found myself hearing it even when I bent over to tie my shoes or rinsed the coffee cup in the sink, that careful stage whisper about cost and appetite. The arithmetic of my existence reduced to a roll on a plate. I tried, as any father tries, to excuse it, to file it away under nerves or exhaustion or the thoughtless habit of someone too used to balancing spreadsheets to notice that hearts do not belong in ledgers. Yet every attempt to soften the blow was followed by some new moment, small on the surface but heavy in consequence, and soon it became impossible to believe that I had misheard. When she called again to ask if I had been taking my pills on schedule, her tone was less inquiry than interrogation, and when I answered yes, she asked me to read the labels aloud to prove it, her voice as firm as a pharmacist and as dismissive as a judge who had already decided the case. I did it because pride shrinks quickly when loneliness is the alternative. But when I hung up, I sat in the kitchen with the bottles in a line, wondering how I'd become the kind of man who had to demonstrate competence like a schoolboy, proving he had memorized the capitals of the states. A few days later, she came by with her husband, unannounced, and though her smile was stretched across her face like a banner on a windy day, the first words out of her mouth were about the rug in the living room being a hazard, about how quickly I could trip, about how easily a fall could end everything, and before I could object, they had rolled it up and carried it out to the garage. Thornton's smirk leaving a shadow behind him as if to remind me that even my own floor was no longer mine. It did not stop there. At the pharmacy, I found my usual prescription had been refilled, not in my name, but in hers. Just for convenience, the clerk explained, as if it were ordinary for a grown man to have his medicine tracked and rationed by his daughter. The next Sunday, at church, she arrived with me like an escort, telling the women of the choir in a falsely light tone how she had to make sure her father didn't skip the service because he forgets sometimes what day it is. And though they patted my hand and smiled the way women smile at children, I saw in their eyes the seed of doubt, the suggestion that perhaps I was slipping, that perhaps the sharp corners of my life were rounding off into incompetence. Each such moment carved a little more of me away, and I began to dread her visits, not because I did not long to see her, but because I knew that afterward I would be left staring at the walls of my own house, asking them to confirm that I still lived there, that I still owned something no one could sign out from under me. The worst came one evening when she invited a neighbor couple to supper at her place and asked me to join, and I went, thinking perhaps she wanted to repair something, only to find myself the subject of a performance, a character in a story she told. For their amusement, how I once left the stove on and nearly burned the house, how I had trouble with my memory and often misplaced important things, how she worried about me wandering off like a child in a mall, and each time I tried to correct her, She laid her hand on mine with that condescending smile, telling them, "You see, he forgets. He really thinks it didn't happen." Until finally they were laughing gently, not cruelly, but pitying, and I realized that in one evening my daughter had redrawn me in the eyes of strangers as a burden wrapped in frailty. I did not explode then, though the words pressed at my throat like stones, because to rage would have been to confirm the caricature she was painting, but something inside me hardened, the way ice does on a pond overnight, unseen until the morning. When a boy throws a rock and hears the crack, after that night I noticed her questions became demands. Her advice became orders, and Thornton, who had always tolerated me with the air of a man keeping a difficult tenant, grew bolder, correcting me in front of her, reminding me that I should not eat this, should not carry that I should not worry about the details of my own accounts, because B has it all in hand now. Each small humiliation stacked upon the last, until I felt like a man living under a pile of invisible stones, struggling to stand straight in his own hallway. Even the dog on the corner, who always greeted me as if I were royalty, seemed to sense something had changed, pressing its nose harder through the slats, as if to anchor me to the idea that somewhere in the world there was still joy in my presence. The culmination of these indignities arrived at a restaurant, a place with linen and waiters who moved like dancers, where she insisted I wear a suit that no longer fit, and then laughed softly to her husband about how it looked like a funeral garment, as though I were walking into my own wake. I ordered a steak, simple, familiar, but she leaned across the table and told the waiter I would have steamed fish. No salt, smiling at him as though it were a kindness to correct me. And when I tried to object, she hushed me with that tone reserved for stubborn children, reminding me that the doctor had forbidden red meat. News to me, but unassailable once spoken with such authority in front of strangers. Thornton raised his phone to take a picture, announcing it was for the twins, and I sat there, forced to smile while my own daughter narrated my decline for the record, her eyes shining with a mixture of triumph and fatigue, as if she had finally succeeded in turning me into the version of myself she had been describing all along. Later that evening, on the boardwalk by the sea, she tried to soothe me with words about love and concern, but I had heard enough, and though I nodded and let her lead me back, inside I knew the ground had shifted. I was no longer a father in her eyes, no longer a man with history and dignity, but a line item, an expense, a liability to be managed until the day came when I would cost nothing at all. That realization did not fall on me like a hammer, but seeped like cold water through a roof, steady and undeniable. And as I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, I understood that the whisper at the table had been only the beginning, the seed from which a whole forest of diminishment had grown, and that I was now living inside that forest, surrounded on every side by voices telling me I was fragile, foolish, forgetful, expensive. It was the first time in my life that I felt not simply unloved, but unacknowledged, as if my presence in the room was useful only as a prop for their story of responsibility, and that knowledge, heavy as it was, began to harden into something else, a kind of resolve that no ledger could calculate, a quiet certainty that this tide of small humiliations was not the end of me, but the beginning of a reckoning I had not yet decided how to shape. They invited me a week later under the flag of a truce that looked, from a distance, like hospitality. A Saturday evening on a fashionable patio where the tables were wide and white and the waiters wore aprons that pretended not to notice the leashed dogs lying at their owners' feet. And my daughter said she wanted to reset the tone and celebrate a small promotion. Nothing fancy, just a good meal and a better mood. And I told myself to go with an unclenched jaw and a soft heart, because sometimes mercy arrives disguised as patience. The air carried the clean bite of rosemary and charcoal, the kind of smell that flatters appetite and forgives memory, and the host led us to a corner where string lights turned everyone into a kinder portrait And there, before my napkin learned my lap, the neighbor from her building appeared with her black lab, a glossy creature named Cooper, who folded himself into the shadow of our table with the resigned serenity of a saint. And if I had been a man who believed in omens, I might have read meaning in the animal's presence, but at 74, I've trained myself to take what the day gives without reaching for the hidden hand behind it. The menu was a confident brag, and my daughter, bright and efficient, took charge of the ordering with the same brisk authority she brings to an email thread, asking about substitutions that would keep everything light and heart-healthy, smiling at the server as if restraint were elegance and not fear, while her husband, always eager to be seen managing something, compared the costs of certain cuts as though the bill were a crossword puzzle whose solution might impress the table. I kept my voice low and agreeable, asked for the ribeye, not because I craved red meat, but because I wanted, in a single, uncomplicated decision, to demonstrate that I still recognized my own hunger, and the server nodded and wrote without judgment, which felt like a small gift in a week that had been stripped of soft edges. Conversation, that careful dance we now do with almost military attention to each step, began with weather and work and her neighbor's new lease. But it could not hold, because control has a gravity of its own, and soon she was back to reminding me about portion sizes and salt and the importance of staying on top of routines. And I responded with the practiced calm of a man who has decided that a raised voice is simply an admission slip to a prison where the guards speak in the language of concern. Yet under the table I could hear Cooper's tail thump once against the wood as if to mark the beat of a drum I alone could hear. The plates arrived on a silvered tide of steam and compliments, my steak shyly bleeding beneath its crosshatch. Her plate a monument to intention, charred carrots arranged like a compass, salmon lacquered to a medicinal sheen, a drizzle of something green that scolded the eye. And for a few seconds we occupied the pleasant hush that comes when appetite introduces itself to opportunity. And I thought perhaps the evening would bend toward ordinary satisfaction. It did not, because control never sleeps, and habit is a jealous god. My daughter, who can fold a reproach into a smile more neatly than I can fold a handkerchief, leaned toward me across the expanse of white linen and said, in that trained half-whisper designed to carry only to the person being corrected, "Remember, Dad, small bites and no seconds. You're expensive when you overdo it." And she tapped my water glass with the same playful authority she once used on a metronome when she practiced piano, and that word she had put in circulation at her apartment and then again, more boldly, on the boardwalk, came back with compound interest, and I felt the room tilt a degree away from me. Not dramatically, not the lurch of a ship, but the quiet slide of a tray, losing its center of balance. I did not think. Thought is the enemy of courage and also its excuse, and what I did came from that small, unburned room in a man where dignity keeps a cot and a lamp. And I lifted my daughter's plate, her exacting composition of carrot and salmon and moral arithmetic, settled it gently on the floor where Cooper's polite nose had been waiting without hope, and said to the dog in the voice I used when Evelyn was 5 and pretended to be a horse in the grocery store aisle, "There you go, friend. Let the one who is affordable enjoy the feast." And Cooper, who had never been invited to such luxury, hesitated as a gentleman would, then accepted the gift with a grateful restraint that put every human at the table to shame. Time changed shape. The patio chorused with conversations that did not include us. The lights hummed, the server froze mid-pour at a table 2 down as if a hunter had been startled on a ridge. My son-in-law pushed back his chair so abruptly it skittered and caught on the slate, and my daughter's mouth made the same small O it made when, at 12, she realized Santa Claus had handwriting indistinguishable from mine. She reached for the plate that was no longer there and then for the authority she usually wears like a jacket. And both were gone, and she hissed my name as though it were a swear word, demanding to know what I thought I was doing, whether I had lost my mind, whether I understood how humiliating it was to be seen with this kind of behavior. And I watched her hands flutter in the air, not searching for her dignity, but for the invisible strings she had grown used to pulling. And I saw, with the kind of sorrow that feels startlingly like relief, that those strings were attached only to themselves. Thornton recovered first, because anger is a shorter distance for him, and he told me to sit down to apologize and to stop embarrassing his wife. And I answered him without heat, because my anger had already done its work and walked out ahead of me into a cooler night, and I said, "I won't apologize for paying with theatrics what you have been charging me in insinuations. You called me expensive. I paid the bill." And then I looked at my daughter, whose face, without the armor of performance, had the naked, startled beauty of the child who once brought me drawings of houses with too many windows, and I said evenly, "There will be no more cost discussions about my appetite or my life. The next time you price me, it will be the last time you see me." The neighbor clutched her pearls in a cliché, almost tender in its predictability. The server arrived with a practiced crisis smile and asked, in that kind of slow tone servers used to diffuse scenes, if everything was all right this evening, and I told him everything was exactly as it ought to be, that some balances require reconciling in a public, and I thanked him for his patience before I laid my napkin down, a quiet flag of truce I no longer needed to wave. My daughter whispered that we should take this outside, then spoke more loudly about how stress wasn't good for me and how she had a call scheduled with a doctor on Monday to discuss next steps in my care. Words heavy with italics that did not require a translator, and I felt then the clean, unflinching hinge of the night swing open. This was not dinner. This was discovery, and here, at last, was the moment I understood not just that I was in danger of being managed into invisibility, but that I could refuse, and that refusal would have a taste I could live with. I stood, not dramatically but steadily, and reached down to touch Cooper's head, because gratitude ought to be witnessed, and I told my daughter, softly so that it would pierce where shouting never can, that I would not be available for any Monday calls or Tuesday plans that treated me like an invoice with legs, that I would be visiting my bank in the morning and speaking with my attorney in the afternoon, that the story of my money and my house and my name would henceforth be written in my own pen. And I watched her blink as if I had changed languages in the middle of a sentence. She asked what I meant by attorney with the suspicion of someone who has found a locked drawer in a desk she assumed already belonged to her, and I told her what I meant. That a man who has been reclassified as a cost must take inventory, that a father who has been priced must set his own price and sometimes must remove himself from the market altogether. And I thanked her for dinner, not because it had been pleasant, but because a final clarity is a kind of feast. I left before the bill arrived, walking slowly past tables where strangers pretended not to watch the old man who had fed a dog with ceremony, and the night outside was a relief, a cool hand on a fevered brow, the streetlights honest in their simple orange glow, the bus stop offering its metal bench without commentary, and as I sat there listening to the wheels of traffic sibilate over tar, I felt the click of decision settle in my bones, a sound only I could hear, the sound a safe makes when it closes and you know exactly where the combination will live from now on. I woke the next morning with a stubborn clarity that follows a fever breaking, the kind of cool, even light in the mind that does not ask for permission from habit. And before the kettle boiled, I had written 3 names on the back of an envelope: my banker, my attorney, my doctor, and under each a verb that belonged to me alone, because action, I discovered, keeps humiliation from hardening into identity. At the bank I spoke softly, but refused to lower my eyes. I asked for printouts, and new cards, and for my accounts to be ring-fenced from helpful relatives, I opted out of every convenience that was in truth a corridor for trespass. And when the manager, a kind woman with a wedding band worn thin by years of good dishes, asked whether I wanted to list my daughter as a contact in case of emergency, I told her that any emergency that needed my daughter to solve it would not be solved in the way I understood the word. And we smiled at one another, the way strangers sometimes do when they understand something terrible without having to say it aloud. At the attorney's, I sat in a chair that had been polished by the backs of men like me, and explained that I wished to revoke every old paper I had signed in good faith when grief made me generous with signatures, that I wanted a clean inventory of the legal furniture of my life and then a locksmith for the doors, and he nodded the way a man nods when he has seen this room before, when he knows the smell of a father being turned into a transaction, and he pulled a file that already had my name on it and, to my surprise but not to my shock, a scan of a draft durable power of attorney with my daughter's email in the metadata, a document no judge had blessed but that spoke loudly about intention, and he said they had inquired 2 weeks earlier about the steps to put it in force if a doctor concurred. And somewhere beneath my ribs a small flame that had been warming itself since the patio flickered higher, not vicious, not vengeful, but bright in the way a lantern is bright when you finally remember where you stored the matches. I thought the escalation would be private, a tug-of-war over paperwork and card numbers and the invisible routes through which control travels, but humiliation prefers witnesses, and my daughter has always liked an audience. So the next blow came with uniforms and clipboards, a polite knock that arranged its face into concern before I opened the door. "Wellness check, sir. We received a call." And behind the officer, 2 women with calm voices and tote bags that smelled faintly of disinfectant introduced themselves with a title that turned my kitchen into a case, and I stood in my doorway barefoot in the kind of quiet that men mistake for compliance, and I answered their questions. About food in the fridge, about medications, about weather. I had fallen lately. Not because I was cowed, but because I understood they, too, were being used as tools by someone who had learned to speak fluently the dialect of worry. They opened my refrigerator as if a father's dignity lives behind the milk. They counted my pills with an expertise that suggested practice. They lifted a throw rug with theatrical triumph and pronounced it a hazard, and when they asked whether there was a responsible family member who could support me in decisions, the phrase landed like a paper cut, small but stinging, and I heard myself say, with the kindest voice I could find, that I had supported my family in decisions for 40 years, that I could point to roof lines and college diplomas and Christmases as evidence, and that, for now, the most responsible support anyone could offer me was the gift of leaving my choices where I had set them. They left me a pamphlet the color of oatmeal and a promise to follow up, and when the patrol car rolled away, sat at the table and let my hands shake for exactly 1 minute, because bodies insist on their own rituals. Then I folded the pamphlet once and slid it into the drawer where I keep spare keys in a jar, a reminder that doors mean more when you are the one who locks them. The phone became a stage next, ringing with precision an hour after every meal, my daughter's name bright on the screen like a headline, and when I stopped answering, because I had learned that silence is not surrender but strategy, the messages turned to texts that traveled a colder road, links to memory care communities with photos of men in sweater vests doing puzzles, questions disguised as kindness that were in fact traps. "Dad, do you remember the last time you took your evening pill? Be honest." Screenshots of an article about older drivers causing accidents accompanied by a breezy suggestion that I should consider giving up my keys, and then, when I did not bite, a new tone sharpened by urgency. A probate attorney she had. Retained had advised a temporary guardianship in case of rapid decline. There would be a brief hearing ex parte to ensure safety, all as if I were a porch plant she intended to move into the shade while I was napping. I took those texts to my lawyer without commentary. And he, a man whose eyebrows only rise for important reasons, allowed them the dignity of paper, printing each one and placing them in a sober folder. And when he called the court, he discovered that, indeed, a petition had been filed with language so oily it left streaks on the page, describing me as increasingly confused, financially impulsive, and vulnerable to scammers, enlisting as evidence a single anecdote about me attempting to feed unsafe food to a dog at a restaurant, the very moment I had used to announce that my appetite would not be priced. I agreed to an independent evaluation, not because I owed anyone proof, but because a clean bill of mind, like a clean bill of health, sometimes shuts a door that words cannot. The neighbors were recruited in absentia too, because rumor is a cheap militia, and at church Mrs. Harper, who means well in a way that hollows out the meaning of the words, took my arm and said she had heard I was having episodes. And at the pharmacy, the young clerk, suddenly formal, asked whether my daughter should be the one to pick up my refills going forward. And the man who used to play checkers with me at the diner inquired, eyes averted, whether I had considered some place with buttons you can press if you fall. And I realized that my daughter's real project was not to move my body, but to move the town's idea of who I was, because once you turn a man into a story, it becomes so much easier to file him under your preferred ending. The final insult in that week of petty coups was mailed rather than delivered, a change of address confirmation from the post office, a neat form acknowledging my request to forward everything to my daughter's apartment for 90 days, which I had not requested, and which I reversed with a trip downtown and a conversation through a scratched plexiglass window that left me laughing at the absurdity of having to prove I still lived at the house the mailman had waved to me at for 29 years. The clerks were kind, kindness being the small coin we pass one another while the larger bills move hand to hand elsewhere, and my anger, usually a shy animal, stood up and showed itself without biting, because I had decided that indignation would not turn me into a spectacle, but into a witness. Some revelations did not arrive by design, but by accident, which is how truth sometimes prefers to travel. A voicemail meant for my daughter's ears found its way to mine. A man from a bank describing a delinquency on a home equity line, his tone crisp with the controlled rudeness of collection, and later a second message from a polite woman at my son-in-law's firm reminding him about the bridge project overrun and the contingency he had personally guaranteed. Phrases that translated without effort into a motive more convincing than filial concern, and with that knowledge, the word expensive slid into its proper slot in the puzzle, not as an adjective for my life, but as a crack in theirs, through which they intended to pour me, like grout. Later that same day, my grandson, who rarely writes anything more than emojis, sent a text that began with "Don't tell Mom" and contained a screenshot of a family chat I was never meant to see. My name abbreviated to OB and discussed as an asset that needed to be stabilized. The verbs mechanical and chilling, and when he followed it with, "Grandpa, I know you, you're not confused," I felt gratitude rise in me so suddenly I had to sit down, because a single voice inside a hostile chorus can sound like a choir. They tried one more trick that week, the oldest trick wrapped in the newest packaging, a courier envelope with a yellow tag and a signature line that rang the doorbell with the legitimacy of the corporate world, and inside, beneath a cover sheet, labeled Update, there sat a stack of forms arranged to look like routine housekeeping. Contact updates, pharmacy authorizations, a transport consent, and in the middle a crisp, durable power of attorney naming my daughter for finance and health, with a notary seal already impressed and a blank where my pen would make their future obedient. I brewed coffee because coffee steadies a hand in more ways than one, and then I took the envelope to the neighbor whose ears had witnessed my humiliation at the restaurant weeks earlier. A retired teacher who has the spine of a fence post and the memory of a tape recorder, and I asked him to look at the line where my name was printed, to look at the space where my compliance was meant to live, and to sign instead the affidavit that my attorney had prepared 2 days before, the one that said I had been subject to pressure and misrepresentation and would henceforth sign nothing that arrived at my door unannounced. The notary at the Chaussons-sur-Aire drugstore, a woman with glitter on her nails, watched my hands as I signed my own counterscript, revocations, designations, instructions, and when she stamped them with her little thunderclap of authority, I felt the odd, buoyant relief of a man who has finally labeled the wires in his basement. All of this would have been enough to crush a softer will. But humiliation, though corrosive when you drink it, can polish you when you use it as a cloth, and by the end of that long, breathless week, I knew 2 things with a certainty that did not ask permission from my fear that my daughter and her husband were not going to stop on their own because they had turned my life into a solution for a problem they had created, and that I would have to make my answer so unambiguous that even their most agile story could not bend it into something usable. I booked an appointment with my primary doctor and asked, for the first time in all our years of friendly small talk, for a letter that did not flatter me but simply described me. A capacity statement free of adjectives, signed in blue ink and placed in a folder I could carry like a passport. And while I waited, I called my insurance agent and changed beneficiaries. I called my bank and removed names that were not mine. I called my utility companies and placed passcodes between my light switches and their intentions, and each small task felt like a rung on a ladder, bringing me closer to a roofline from which the view might make sense again. The second escalation, then, was not a shout, but a tightening, a slow cinch of straps designed to shrink the space in which I could stand upright, and each time I pushed back I learned something that made the straps easier to see. That my daughter's love, however real it once was, had been conscripted into a war against embarrassment and debt, that my son-in-law's contempt had finally found a project grand enough to match his appetite, and that their plan, polished in the language of safety, was nothing less than the removal of my consent from the story of my life. I'm not a grand strategist. I'm a man who balanced books and mowed his lawn and bought school shoes in August, but standing in my kitchen with the welfare check pamphlet tucked into a drawer and the court's stamp on my evaluation letter and the courier's empty envelope bent neatly into the trash. I felt the plain dignity of a counter-move gather its weight, not theatrical, but thorough, and I promised myself that when I acted next, it would not be to argue or to plead, but to decide, because decisions, unlike arguments, do not beg for acknowledgement, they simply change the locks. The confrontation did not arrive with thunder, but with the flat light of morning, the kind of day where the air itself feels undecided, as though the world is holding its breath for something to be settled, and I knew by the restlessness in my hands that the hour had come when avoidance was no longer an option, when the thread of indignities and manipulations had wound itself so tight that the only act left was to cut it clean. They came to me not with apology, but with fury, the black SUV pulling up at the curb outside the cafe where I had been nursing a pot of bitter tea, their faces pale not from shame, but from the shock of discovering that their quarry had teeth. My daughter entered first, her movements frantic and brittle, her voice already raised so that passers-by turned their heads, spitting accusations about betrayal, about how I had destroyed their lives, about houses and cars and accounts, as though those bricks and numbers mattered more than blood. Thornton followed, cooler but with that simmering contempt he had worn like a second skin since the day he married into this family, and together they herded me into a corner table where the air thickened with a hatred so sharp it almost hummed. I let them rage, because rage is a poor instrument. It dulls itself in use, and when they had spent their first storm, I answered not with denial, but with truth, a truth so plain it could not be negotiated, that they had abandoned me in a strange town, without documents or credit, that they had rifled through my belongings and stolen what was mine, that they had conspired to declare me incompetent with forged papers, and that I had, through patience and quiet action, dismantled their scheme and reclaimed what dignity and authority they thought gone forever. My daughter tried to interrupt, waving her hands as though she could erase facts with gesture, claiming it had all been for my safety, that I was confused, that they had only wanted to protect me from myself, and I watched her words collapse under the weight of their own falsity, because protection that begins with theft is nothing but conquest, and she knew I would not let her rewrite the scene this time. Thornton leaned in then, his voice low and venomous, asking what I thought I had achieved, telling me that money could not buy me a family, that in the end I would die alone, and I smiled at him, not with triumph, but with the weary grace of a man who has outlasted storms before, and told him that solitude freely chosen is sweeter than company bought with lies, and that if the cost of my peace was their absence, then it was the best bargain I had ever struck. My daughter flinched, because beneath all her calculations, she still carried some memory of being loved, some echo of childhood where my hand had steadied hers across a busy street, and she tried then to wound me not with schemes, but with cruelty, spitting that her mother had never loved me, that Lavinia had confided to her daily complaints about my indifference, about her regret in marrying me. For a moment the floor tilted, because even lies can scrape the bones if they are aimed well. But then I remembered my wife's hand on mine in the hospital, her laugh in the garden, the small unrecorded gestures of 40 years, and I knew that this was my daughter's last weapon, the attempt to strip from me not money but memory. I told her softly that marriage is a tapestry of flaws and forgiveness, that her mother and I had fought and reconciled as all couples do, but that love had been the thread binding every square, and I would not allow her, not even my own flesh, to desecrate that truth. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. For the first time I saw in my daughter's face not triumph or calculation, but the smallest glint of defeat, the realization that her father, the man she had tried to reduce to a ledger entry, still stood unbroken, still capable of naming lies and rejecting them. I rose then, not hurried, not theatrical, but with the steady balance of someone who has finally placed the last brick in a wall of self-defense, and I told them I wanted nothing more from them. Not apology, not explanation, not reconciliation, that our story together was finished, that they would have their share of money to begin again elsewhere, but that my life, my choices, and my dignity were no longer theirs to claim. Thornton sneered, muttering that I was a fool, that family cannot be severed like contracts, but his words rang hollow even to him, and my daughter, trembling between rage and grief, whispered that I would regret this when death came to me in an empty room. I looked at her, the woman who had once been the girl with dimples and crayons, and said that what I would regret is clinging to the illusion of family where there was none, that loneliness among liars is far heavier than solitude among truths, and then I stepped past them, leaving the cafe into the bright, ordinary air. On the street the world had not shifted. Cars still hissed along the asphalt, children still tugged at their mothers' coats, pigeons still hunted crumbs, but inside me a tectonic plate had moved, a grinding resolution that the years of being diminished were over. I walked with no haste, but every step felt lighter, as if the chains of obligation and guilt had been slipping silently from my shoulders. Behind me, I could hear my daughter calling, her voice breaking on the edge of desperation, but I did not turn, because to turn would have been to reopen a door I had just locked with finality. Ahead of me, the sidewalk stretched plain and unadorned, and for the first time in years I felt it belonged to me alone, each crack in the concrete a marker of my own path, not theirs. The climax was not in the fury of their accusations, or even in my rebuttal. It was in the quiet certainty that I had severed the last thread of their control, that I had chosen myself, and that whatever years remained would be mine in truth, not measured by the stinginess of their love, but by the fullness of my own resolve. The weeks after the cafe felt less like a victory lap and more like a slow rearranging of furniture inside my life, a deliberate clearing of pathways so I would stop bumping my shins in the dark, and I found that each ordinary task, setting the kettle on, writing a check for rent at the little apartment by the lake, learning which shelf in the new market hid the tea I like, became a kind of benediction because it was chosen by me and for me, not negotiated or supervised or explained to someone who needed my choices to be cheaper. I met the building manager's wife, who kept basil on every windowsill like small green flags of peace. I learned the name of the boy who swept the courtyard and whistled without self-consciousness. I began to attend the morning coffee at the community room where a few men my age traded the harmless lies of fishermen and the precise truths of blood pressure readings. And on Sundays, I returned to church with a steadier spine, not to announce forgiveness to anyone who had not asked for it, but to sit where the hymnals could remind me that voices sound richer when they stand together, even if standing together sometimes requires you to leave a few names out. I gave myself 2 projects, one for the hands and one for the heart. For the hands, I began volunteering at the animal shelter near the bus yard, washing bowls and folding blankets until the room smelled like soap and hope. And there I learned that a dog will receive a kindness without asking what it cost you to offer it, which is perhaps the purest education an old man can still receive. For the heart, I went through the house I had left behind and took only what memory required. Marianne's scarf, 3 photographs where the light does what it should, the album with the lake summers and the spelling bee, the little wind-up music box that played 6 brave notes before it surrendered, leaving the rest to be auctioned and hauled so that my mind would not be tempted to camp on old ground as if the past could be rented month to month. Paperwork followed like a faithful shadow, and I let it, because documents can be shields if you hold them correctly. I signed the new will at the attorney's desk and watched the ink dry on instructions that were simple and unarguable. A trust for the senior center's meal program that quietly keeps refrigerators from becoming symbols of neglect. A bequest to the legal aid clinic that helped me push back against a story others were writing about me, and a small scholarship in Marianne's name for a local nurse who plays the piano at church on Wednesdays and knows how to listen without auditioning for sainthood. I left something more personal for the only family member who stepped out of the chorus to sing a decent note. The grandson who texted, awkward and brave, to say he knew I was not confused, an envelope with the albums, the music box, and a letter that told him what no one had told me at 19, that adulthood is not a receipt you present to prove your worth, but a series of small loyalties you keep when nobody is watching, and that if he ever wishes to know me, he can knock on my door and be answered like a man, not an expense. News about my daughter and her husband reached me the way weather does, indirectly and without malice. A comment from the realtor about a lease signed across town, a sentence in the paper about a bridge bid that had not gone their way, and each time I felt the reflex to measure my mood against their fortune. I chose instead to water the basil for my neighbor, or fold another stack of shelter towels, because I have learned at last that revenge is a poor gardener, and sows only weeds in the beds, where gratitude belongs. Once, on a Tuesday that smelled like rain, an envelope without a return address arrived with handwriting that could have been hers or any anxious hand, and inside was nothing accusatory or tender, only a copy of some old photograph where we 3 are laughing in a kitchen lit by winter sun, and I understood that memory is the only inheritance we share that cannot be litigated. So I placed the picture in the album and closed the cover without ceremony, letting the past be what it had been, no more and no less. the court matters ended as they always do, not with trumpets, but with stamps and signatures, and when the final wire came through and the last receipt was filed, I walked to the lake and sat on the bench that catches the evening light just right and decided that my life would henceforth be measured not by what had been taken or returned, but by what I could still give, without impoverishing myself. Sometimes that is as small as carrying a bag of rotisserie chicken to the shelter and watching the dogs forget their caution for a minute of joy. Sometimes it is as invisible as phoning the parish clerk to quietly cover the cost of the broken handrail. And sometimes it is simply staying seated when a familiar sadness tries to drag me into old arguments, letting it pass like a train in the night while I keep my hands around a warm cup and remember that dignity, once reclaimed, needs ordinary maintenance more than dramatic defense. I do not pretend that the wound is gone, only that it is scarred in a way that does not throb every time the weather changes, and on evenings when the maple throws the same generous shadow my old house knew. I tell Marianne in the voice reserved for the faithful and the dead that I am doing as she would have me do, living within my means of money and mercy, refusing to price myself for those who insist everything must carry a tag. And when I pass the corner where a neighbor's dog strains against the leash because he recognizes in me a man who will always stop to scratch a grateful head, I remember the plate I lowered at that patio table and the line I spoke that sounded like a joke but was, in truth, a vow. And I smile to think that and I fed what was hungry, and I saved for myself what was mine to keep, and that the cost of my life, finally and at last, is paid in full by the quiet happiness of being its rightful owner.